This video is going to be mostly about palette knife painting, but you'll see I do some other mark making as well. Here's the image that I'm starting with. And I say mostly because you can see I've laid out the paint with a palette knife, but then I am doing a little bit of smoothing with a large dry brush. I'm kind of moving back and forth between the two tools. This is primarily a mixture of cerulean blue with white, and then there is a little bit of cobalt blue mixed in as well. And that varies a little bit as I move through the painting. Started with a white canvas in this case, which is kind of unusual for me. Generally I do tinted canvas, but because I wanted to be able to lay out the white sky on top, and I kind of wanted to do an experiment and see, since this was a more quickly put together piece, how it would work on white canvas. Trying not to do too much fussing with the paint. If you know my style of painting, you know that I do a lot of fussing. So I'm attempting here to do a little bit of blending, but leave some areas just as I lay them out initially. Different canvas textures too will give you more or less sort of drag from the palette brush or from the brush. In this case, I kind of went in there with that pale brown color with a brush before I went back with the palette knife. I did it thinly. Again, it's all a matter of experience. I didn't go super thin because I didn't want the paint to be watery, but I just used a little bit of Gamsol on the brush so that I could get a thin layer and then be able to go on top of it with a thicker layer. When you work with the palette knife, it's pretty much always going to be thicker paint, so in order to get an underneath color and be able to sort of scrape back into it so I can move the paint around a little bit on the canvas, I'm doing the combination of the first layer and then going back on top of it with the palette knife. This is a small canvas, so I'm using a small palette knife. When I set down that water that's sitting on top of the brown initially, I kind of wanted to make sure that I was going to be able to get that consistency of the paint sitting on top of other paint. The paint that's going on top of the sky area, the sky paint, is a little thicker. So these smaller shapes and moving sort of lightly through it, because you want to think about how much pressure you're putting on the brush as well. You can see sometimes I'm sort of pulling the paint down with the palette knife and either allowing some of the color that's underneath to show through. And actually I do think that it is beneficial to have a tinted canvas, because then you can always adjust the color by putting something on top of it. But if you drag through, you get the color of the dried canvas underneath. So I guess actually same thing could be true with the white as well. I'm using like a small rubber tipped makeup brush here and sort of running it through there randomly to pull a little bit of the paint off and get some of that color underneath to show through. I am going to go back on top of it later in some areas with a lighter color to brighten it up just a little bit. I'm thinking about having my strongest contrasts in the foreground, so going in with the darker value here, and then because this is a little bit closer, I'm using that rubber tip again. But you can see here I'm going in with some lighter areas to brighten it up just a little bit. So they're not all uniform, but there's some organic happening. And then I'm kind of moving the paint around again with the rubber tip brush. This painting I worked on for probably about 3 hours altogether, maybe 4 hours. Again, thinking about the strongest contrast, and also I'm laying out stripes of color so that I can blend them together with the knife when I go back in. And generally I work background to foreground. It seems to be a little bit cleaner that way, but I will go back in other areas of the painting as well, but just not doing the whole thing, just kind of little portions of it. I've got some marks on the top in the sky that I tried to scrape away a little bit. They're sort of over, I don't know, about 20% of the way. It's kind of messy on top of that one yellowish green tree. I'm going to go back in after it dries and paint over it. So here I'm able to kind of just drag the brush very lightly with that sort of dry brush technique across, so that I don't get a strong solid line, but I get some color left behind from the paint, but also some of the beach area showing underneath. Palette knife is great for giving you those sort of organic shapes so that things are not too uniform. You can't get as uniform as you would with a brush. This is what I was talking about. I'd go back in and make some slight adjustments, still keeping in mind those ideas about how much contrast I want to add to the background, because I do want to keep it as less than the amount that I have in the foreground. But here, the small brush again going in to get those shapes with the trees. And this is after I've had a chance to sort of fix that mushiness that was happening above those trees. So now I can go in with my final touches and add a little bit of branches, as well as any final details I want to include. Again, working those final details in. With water scenes, I always find that if I can keep things level, they read more like water. This is kind of a combination of removing paint in certain areas as well as adding it in certain areas. And here is the finished product.